reaching out. So
There's not.
yeah. You guys support it.
I wonder what it's going to take.
Right.
You know, just
I know.
maybe students. I mean, like,
Right.
student examples, a student creating, sort of, demonstration. Maybe it's still not real hard. What it is. Maybe just kind of that tool.
And that's where the initial issues with
See, I do read your portfolio. Yes, I do read your portfolio. Yes, and so that is very cool. Yes.
I know, I was telling Paul, I know with like YouTube,
It's kind of a weird question. Like sort of, what are you hearing?
but I almost wish we would have done it at the end of the day today. And I have to do it after everything's really done. But there's some step right now that we're struggling to figure out. And that's what I
A couple of things. So that will keep me honest at least for the next 6 weeks.
Well, good morning, almost good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I know that I'm holding a microphone, but you're not hearing it overhead, and that's because we have some people who are watching on the other end of the camera. So when it does come time for Q&A, we'll pass around the microphone. One of those things just to kind of be cognizant of. But with us today, and I have a couple notes here, so. With us today, we have Tracy Penny Light. She's an assistant professor and has relatively recently become the executive director for the Center of Student Engagement and Learning Innovations at Thompson River University. She joins us here with Helen Chen, who gave a presentation yesterday. We're really excited to have them up here. I met both of them actually over the summer at a conference in Boston and had the pleasure of running with Tracy actually along the Boston River. It was actually a wonderful experience. Today she's here and she is going to be presenting on pathways for learning and bridging curricular and co-curricular learning with ePortfolio. So thank you all for coming. And Tracy, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Heather. Well, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day to join me this afternoon. Willie was asking a question about, is this a real bridge? And it's the design of a walking bridge in China, and I have the reference in my slides, which we'll share. But I like it because it's designed on the idea of a Mobius ring, so that idea that it's sort of, you can twist it and turn it, but it's all kind of part of the same pathway. And I think that's a good metaphor for what learning looks like for lots of us, actually, and certainly in the students that I am working with at Thompson Rivers University, which is a campus very similar to your own. It's open access. We have students coming to us from all different backgrounds and walks of life at all different stages of their learning career. And so part of the work that I'll be talking about today is efforts that we're undertaking to really ensure that they get to take responsibility and have the opportunity to sort of chart their own pathway for learning on our campus, which is my attempt to sort of push the boundaries a little bit of what we do in our traditional university education to perhaps make it more meaningful for life in the 21st century. So I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time giving you some background to the thinking around the work that we do with ePortfolio learning and where this idea for ePortfolios not really comes from, but sort of where we're at with portfolio thinking today, and how that relates to innovation and engagement in 21st century learning, and then provide you with some thoughts on opportunities that I see for bridging learning between the curricular and co-curricular context on our campuses, and then give you some examples of the actual project that we're undertaking on our campus. So to set the stage, there's this whole ePortfolio idea, which I know you've been engaging with and thinking about on your campus. This comes out of some of the work that we do. I'm the vice chair of the board for the Association of Authentic, Experiential, and Evidence-Based Learning, or ABLE. And we've been thinking through, with many of our colleagues, this whole notion of what is an ePortfolio. And when Helen and I started to do this work in the early 2000s, ePortfolios really were about the use of the electronic medium to start allowing students to make sense of and document their learning. And as Helen discussed yesterday, the E is really a given today. We don't really think about the electronic as being so important. And I would define that portfolio idea today as more about the process, so engaging students in thinking about their learning over time. It's developmental. It's really a pedagogy that we employ in our classrooms in getting students to do that kind of thinking. And it's really about learning. We really, I think, want to enable our learners to make connections and transfer the learning between and among contexts if we want them to be successful in the 21st century. And so, and that notion of creating their own pathway through their learning career, I think, is really central to that. So that's where my thinking around ePortfolios is today, rather than the electronic as we used to think about it in the past. Obviously, this is important because, as you all know, our context for learning is changing in the 21st century. We have new technologies that are really pushing boundaries for learning, and that notion that learning is everywhere. We're living in a globalized world. It's not enough to think about what's happening at the University of Alaska Anchorage, but we need our learners to be thinking about what's happening elsewhere as well. So I think that opens up new spaces. There's an increasing need for analysis and critical thinking skills because we have access to information everywhere. I think we really need to be training our students to make sense of that information, so really embedding digital literacy into our programs. And so just to give you a bit of background, I'm a historian by training and have taught both in irregular history departments and in interdisciplinary departments. And when I talk about this with some of my colleagues, they're like, well, that's not really my job to engage my students in thinking about digital literacy. And I actually disagree. I think it is our job, and we need to be able to embed that kind of thinking into our disciplines regardless of what our backgrounds are. We need to find ways to help learners to make connections between the learning that happens in different contexts so that they can really demonstrate the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they are developing as they work through our programs. And that really, to me, speaks of the notions of reflection and action. So we want them to reflect on their learning as they're making connections, and we want them to do something with it, right? So it's not enough to say, well, yeah, what you're talking about in history connects to my civil engineering class, but rather, what are you going to do with that knowledge once you've acquired it? How will you transfer and make sense of it? And we need to, of course, document that we are meeting the learning outcomes. We have a culture of accreditation and assessment on our campuses, and while I don't think that should drive what we're doing, I do think that we should be making sure that our learners are developing the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we've designed for them within our particular course context. And ePortfolios really provides an opportunity for us to make visible, authentic evidence of learning. So rather than just sort of having data that tells us a lot about the numbers and things, what does that authentic evidence look like when we provide them with opportunities to capture it in ePortfolios? What's most important for learning today? Well, I already sort of alluded to this notion. And this is from Carol Geary Schneider, and I'll just read it for you because I know the fonts are a little bit dark. So Carol, as you probably know, is the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, or AAC&U. And she says the most important aspects of a high-quality education are broad, big-picture learning, cutting-edge scholarly inquiry, deep engagement with hard questions, and evidence-based reasoning. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me in this context. Sarah Stein Greenberg, who's the director of Stanford's Design School, or the D School, asks the question, what are our students' missions as part of their Stanford 2025 work, where they're really revisioning what does the university look like in the future. And I love this notion where we are maybe moving beyond, what am I going to major in, to what do I want to do with the rest of my life. And Helen talks a lot about, the jobs that we're preparing students for may not even exist yet. And so how can we allow for students to think through what might they want to do in the future that's part of a mission as opposed to part of their major. Not to say that I don't want students to think about history as a major. Of course, that's an important discipline for me, but I think I want them to be asking, how can I use that historical thinking to serve in other kinds of ways once I graduate? This is all wrapped up in the notion of integrative learning, which is not a new concept. In fact, this quote comes from Mary Taylor Huber and Pat Hutchings from 2004. They wrote a little booklet called Integrative Learning, Mapping the Terrain. And they talk about integrative learning in this sense. They note that one of the greatest challenges in higher education is to foster students' abilities to integrate their learning across contexts and over time. So obviously I've been very influenced by this. They say that learning that helps develop integrative capacities is important because it builds habits of mind that prepare students to make informed judgments in the context of their personal, professional, and civic life. When I think about what I do in higher education today, that's what I'm really trying to get at. I want my learners to leave not only my classroom but my campus prepared to tackle complex issues, to tolerate ambiguity, to be able to work and value others from different perspectives so that they can really effectively engage in civic life. I think our students are the future of the world. I think we have a huge responsibility to make sure that they are well equipped to make sense of that, rapidly changing and complicated landscape that they'll enter as citizens once they leave our campus. Well, they're citizens when they're on our campus as well, but I really want them to be able to wrestle with those problems and to make sense of them in a way that will help them to contribute back to our world. I often say, if we don't do a good job on our campuses, we're going to be stuck with some folks who are perhaps not best equipped to manage those problems. And so I think we really do have an important job ahead of us. So if we think about this notion of engagement for learning, the engagement premise itself suggests that with ongoing study, increased subject knowledge, practice, and feedback from faculty, and I would add peers, students gain deeper understandings. And so if we're thinking about designing really effective learning experiences for our students, how would we engage them in these kinds of practices? Because when we do that, and this comes out of the work from the National Survey of Student Engagement, George Koo and his colleagues, they argue that students then become more adept at managing complexity, tolerating that ambiguity that we see in the world, and working with people from multiple and different backgrounds so that they really do value others. And I think when I think about the work that's happening here at UAA in Native Student Services, they're doing some really interesting, or about to do some interesting ePortfolio work that really thinks about the student as a whole, and how can portfolios help us to not only allow them to be more engaged, but to celebrate the values, cultures, experiences that they bring into our classrooms and that are a part of their whole self. I like that notion that they use of becoming aware. And so how can we open up space for our students to become aware of who they are, what they value, what kind of learning they bring into our classrooms. And I think we sometimes think about them as a blank slate, and yet when they come into our classroom, they've already learned lots of stuff. How can we help them to make connections between those various things? So there are lots of opportunities for innovation and engagement in this landscape, I think, and this comes from the Connect to Learning project that was started by LaGuardia Community College, and their research notes that successful ePortfolio initiatives really do advance a reflective and integrative social pedagogy for ePortfolio. So there you see that process and pedagogy idea coming out again, that aims to build student learning and help students author new identities as learners. And I think this is really what we are all about, thinking about who are you as a learner and what does what you're learning here connect to the rest of what you want to do. So I think there are opportunities for collaborative partnerships, and certainly here at UAA, there's lots of evidence of that happening, which is really exciting. Opportunities for interdisciplinary learning. I think ePortfolio work often gives us a chance to think about how we might connect with others who are doing similar kind of work, or perhaps training their students to meet similar kinds of outcomes in different disciplines. One of the most rewarding experiences that I had, I was teaching in an interdisciplinary program called Sexuality, Marriage, and Family Studies, and I had a friend who was teaching in religious studies, and we realized, and her course was called Sex and World Religions, and we realized, oh gee, you know, we're addressing some of the same kinds of outcomes. Maybe we could get our students together for a class, and then maybe we could design an ePortfolio activity where they were reflecting on what did it mean to engage with students who were in a different disciplinary context and who also were thinking about sexuality in different contexts. And wow, what a rich experience that, and then beyond the two classes meeting, the students also had all these other connections, and so we saw these fantastic webs of intersection around the different students from different perspectives, which was quite exciting. And had we not been using portfolios, we wouldn't have seen that evidence. You know, she and I may have got a glimmer of that on the answer to a test question, but the portfolios really made that learning visible, which was quite exciting. We can also engage in flexible and lifelong learning approaches, and so I think by its very nature, ePortfolio work celebrates and fosters that notion of lifelong learning. We want to inspire our students to think about learning not just while they're here, but also beyond. And then student-centered teaching and assessment. And I'll share with you some examples of the ways that I think this notion of bridging really does celebrate those two areas. So why would we want to bridge between the curricular and co-curricular spaces, or we might think about academic affairs and student affairs? And I think it's because there are really neat opportunities for learning. The first idea is that bridging really focuses on learning in all its forms, and you can see lots of different bridges here. They all are similar in some way, but they also look different. I almost feel like this is kind of a Sesame Street type slide, which some of our learners might not even know what that is anymore, but but you can see that the bridges all have lots of similarities, but also interesting differences as well, and I think our students are that way as well. They might all sit in a classroom just as you are, in rows, being prepared to take in the information, but they all come to us with different knowledge, skills, and abilities that sometimes go unnoticed if we don't ask them to think what those are. Bridging really requires time and space. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of some of the work that we do with faculty, is how can you build in opportunities for time and space for students to really reflect on, ooh, this is very sensitive, Helen, and make connections to that learning that happens in different contexts. We live in a really busy world. I'm sure many of you are constantly running between things. I know our students are doing that as well. They're often working, they have families, and doing lots of other stuff. Sometimes they're involved in athletics or whatever it might be. To build in opportunities for students to really reflect on those connections, to really understand what it is they're learning, to ask questions is so essential in our busy life. And so I think this is a really important component of what we do. I would advocate that bridging promotes learning for change. When we give students that opportunity to make connections, to bridge the learning that happens in different contexts, we also open up space for them to explore that question, what's my mission? I'm not even touching it. I'm going to put it down. It must be my electric personality that's causing those things to happen. We give them opportunities to really think not only what's my mission, but what am I going to do when I leave the classroom? How can we open up spaces for them to consider those exciting opportunities? So why a bridge? Well, learning happens in places other than the classroom. And I have to say, growing up as a historian, really I thought learning that happened in the classroom, and also maybe in the archives, you know, when you go and you find new documents and things. It's moving on its own. It's not even me, okay. I don't know why there's a timing anyway. So we'll just, try and make it stop. you know, we really want to think about what happens in other contexts. And so here on the right-hand side, you see a report that recently came out from the Lumina Foundation, which is all about connecting credentials. So what kinds of learning is happening? How are students being recognized for their learning in other contexts? On the left is a portfolio where, again, students are having an opportunity to do this. And as I said, as a historian, you know, I thought about learning that happened in the classroom, and certainly back in the Middle Ages when I was taking classes, that is primarily where it happened. We really didn't do a whole lot of co-curricular stuff that got brought into the classroom, but students today do. And I think it's a really easy thing for us as faculty members to ask, where else are you learning? What other connections are you seeing to what we're doing in this class with other things that you're doing? And students, I have to say, most of the time tell me, I don't think I'm allowed to do that, right? I'm supposed to just focus on what we're doing in here. And I say, no, it's okay. Tell me, are you working where you're using some of this information? Does it come into play when you're at home with your family? Are there other classes that you're taking? And as soon as I open up that space and opportunity, students do make connections when they feel like they're able to, and connections that I would never imagine. And so that's really exciting. And the other exciting piece about that is they share with each other. And so, you know, I've had students say, oh, I should take that sociology class, or gee, I didn't know that I could get involved in an internship related to what I'm interested in studying in the future. And so you start to get that collaborative opportunity, which is really quite exciting. You know, this idea that making connections really fosters transformative learning for students. This is actually an ePortfolio from Stanford in a program that Helen runs. Portfolio to professoriate. Oh my gosh. And you can kind of get a sense here of where this particular student had an opportunity, you know, talks about vocation as the place where your deep gladness meets the world's great hunger. And that's a quote from someone, but, you know, where they're thinking about how can I use the education that I've gained here at Stanford to connect to lots of different things, which is quite exciting. And bridging by learners also fosters transformative learning for instructors. So if any of you have ever heard me talk before, you will have seen this slide. This is a portfolio that came out of the very first class that I taught with ePortfolios. It was a history class called History 200, or History in Film. The students lovingly referred to it as Monday Night at the Movies, and the chair asked me to take on the class to make it more rigorous. So I had students coming from across the disciplines in lots of different contexts, not going to be history majors, and I thought, you know, how can I make this more relevant for them? How can I ensure that they're going to take something from this class and transfer it to another context? And so I decided to focus the course. The theme was Cold War America, because there are great films and lots of good things you can discuss in that context. But I decided to really think through, what does it mean to think historically? And I modeled the class around what we do as historians in practice and helping them to develop those skills. And so what I got were portfolios where students said, oh, you know, I'm in civil engineering and we don't actually do historical thinking, but we do undertake a process of critical thinking and analysis that's similar. And so here's how I'm transferring what I learned in History 200 to some other contexts. This ePortfolio is from a student who went on to major in history. And even though he was really keen on history, he got to the space where history is more than about books. You know, that's what he'd learned as a high school student, and it allowed him to take, as he describes it, a more holistic approach to the discipline, where he looked at sources differently and asked critical questions about, can I use a contemporary film as a source for doing history? Which is an interesting question, because most of us would on the surface say, no, that's not what you do. And so I thought this was quite exciting to hear him talk about the evolution of his critical thinking, to make connections to trips that he'd gone on with his family where he'd visited historical sites and started to rethink, how could I use that in terms of informing my interpretation, which is probably the #1 skill that history students have a hard time with, because they think history is a narrative. not their interpretation. And it's hard to get them to that stage where they understand, oh, you mean I can interpret history myself? So it was quite exciting, and so really transformative to me, for me, because I got to see the thinking that underpinned their final assignments, which was the portfolio. This is an image from Stanford, which is really Helen's image to sort of map out what the pathway through an undergraduate learning career looks like, and really use this to sort of say that we need to make sure that learners have opportunities to really think about who they are as learners across the learning career. And when Helen talks about this, this image, she talks about where are the spaces where we might provide students with opportunities to do that kind of thinking. And so I think in our own context, it's really important to think beyond our individual courses to programs, et cetera, for where we might provide them with opportunities to think about the development of their identity as learners in our courses and beyond. The next slide is, here are our students in rows in the box of the classroom, and yet, which is the challenge for us because that's the setup that we have, much like you're sitting here, but we know that those learners are learning in lots of other spaces. And so, yet, what we really have in the classroom is the professor that takes over it all, right? It's all about us, typically. And where do we, again, ask that question, what connections are you making? It's so easy. So to give you a sense of bridging for transformative learning, this is some ePortfolio work that's happening on my campus. And again, when we open up that space, you get a student like Haley saying, wow, readers of my portfolio are treating me like the expert, right? Simone is talking about how her perspective on Canada as a global leader changed because of some of the courses that she's taken at TRU and the experience that she gained studying abroad. And we see how this really fits into that notion of essential learning outcomes where we can really think through what does this mean for us in terms of our instruction, what outcomes are we trying to meet, how can we build in these experiences for our students, and what kinds of artifacts or evidence might they produce in their portfolios that are different. So, I've moved away fairly substantially from traditional research papers in my courses to looking at what are some of the other kinds of artifacts and evidence that students can create. In that history and film class, I opened up an opportunity at that stage still, write a research paper if you like, or you could create a creative assignment. And I, sort of basically that had to address the outcomes for the research assignment. I got films, I got songs, I got all kinds of different representations of the students' interpretation of historical thinking just by opening up space for different kinds of evidence. And so I think that's quite exciting for us in our work. So if we want to think about creating pathways for learning, what might that look like? Well, on my campus, we have a real diverse set of students, as I mentioned. We've got everything from vocational areas like trades and technology, culinary arts in the center, through to a faculty of law and graduate programs. So I think we really want to make sure that we have opportunities for learners to become agents of their learning and identities and to sort of chart their pathway that might look quite convoluted. And as individual students, it'll look different for everybody. The learning in portfolios, I think, opens up space for that as we give students opportunities to think through where are those various connections happening. And I thought it might make sense for you just to have a quick listen to what that sounds like from the students themselves.
I thought, oh, I'm going to have lots of pictures, I'm going to have lots of this and lots of that. It was not the case. I wasn't excited at all. So I thought, okay, am I going to have enough time to devote to this? I really did not know what to expect.
My expectation was challenging.
Am I have enough information and experience to showcase what I have?
I was quite discouraged in the beginning, actually.
I realized how much I can actually achieve with it. It gave me
the opportunity to like actually look back on my experiences. It's personal, it's your own self.
I didn't expect all of the opportunities that came out of it.
Anything that you've ever done in your life, any volunteer work, career, what you're taking in school, and it's a process of self-reflection.
I started thinking of things, artifacts that I could grab from home to photocopy and put on, thinking of different posts that I wanted to do.
Different people sharing their the ways how they build their ePortfolio.
We met on a mostly weekly basis, and we just getting more and more ideas. Oh, I want to include this, I want to include that.
I'm not the only one interested in the topic. It's everyone else is even more interested than I am in some cases, and they want to know more, and they're treating me like the expert.
Focusing more on like the reflection aspect of it.
And it actually helps you like reflect on what you do. Wow, I totally forgot that these are what I have done so far. We're really proud of the work that we've done, and we want to share it with Thompson Rivers University staff and students. And now looking back and say I'm glad that I did it, so that I can always have something to look back to and show other people and say, this is what I've accomplished.
And I will not stop there. I will still continue working on my ePortfolio. Thank you.
My name is Tatiana. Janice Young. Brianna McElwaw.
Haley Dunavin.
Dexter Armstrong.
Catherine Sarah.
Saiba Bibiza Ferrer Golatan.
So you can hear that when you give them an opportunity, you know, initially it's, and certainly we've seen that here too, some of the students are like, oh, that's overwhelming. What am I going to put in there? How do I make connections? That it really is a developmental ability. And so when we're designing learning experiences, really making sure that we scaffold for the learners those various things so that we can address some of those concerns like, do I have anything to put in there? You know, what would I put in there to showcase who I am and to document who I am as a learner and who I am as a person? They talked about the process, you know, that opportunity to look back on their experiences. And I loved, Haifa at the end says, you know, and I'm going to continue to do my portfolio. You know, this is not something that is a one-time standalone kind of activity, but it's something that we want to develop those habits of mind in our students. And again, going back to Haley, that notion that readers of the portfolio treat me like the expert, and they are experts on themselves as learners, right? And they need our feedback and guidance around where there are opportunities to continue to develop. But at the end of the day, it's about them. It's not about us sort of saying, fit into my history box or whatever it might be. So in this idea, we really wanted to allow our students to develop a sense of their own pathway through their learning at the institution around 5 areas that actually are our strategic priorities. So student success, intercultural understanding, undergraduate research capacity, entrepreneurial capacity, and sustainability. So you can imagine words like entrepreneurial capacity and sustainability, and some contexts are a little unclear. You know, if I talk to my colleagues in the history department, well, we don't do entrepreneurship, so people often think about entrepreneurial meaning business. And I think really what the campus was aiming for is thinking entrepreneurial and employing those entrepreneurial mindsets to the kind of work that we want to do. So if we want to develop students in terms of these 5 areas, which incidentally map to our institutional graduate attributes, what could that look like and where is that space for them to do that? So we started thinking about the TRU grad in the center of all of these priorities and thinking about what would it mean if they were discovering some of those priorities, if they were making connections between them, if they were experiencing them, oh, it's doing it again, and if they become. And so this idea that we want the learner to really tell us where they're at different levels in order to be successful. So I think in that idea, the value proposition for learners is that they get some choice over their own path and through their learning career. So it's not about come in and do check off the boxes that we say you should check off for a particular degree or whatever. It gives them opportunities to be recognized for the knowledge, skills, and abilities across their learning experiences, which is where the bridging comes in, and really fosters that notion of lifelong learning and professional growth and development. For us as educators, I think the value is that when we give opportunities for this bridging to happen, great things go on. We can't anticipate what that might be, which I think for some people feels a little bit risky. I actually think about the opportunities that come out of not quite knowing what connections the students will make. That's not to say we don't need very clearly defined learning outcomes. We need that really good alignment between the outcomes, the learning activities, and the assessment strategies. So we need to do all of that thinking up front, but then we can think through what types of evidence actually meet the outcomes, and that's sort of where we're going with this program. So how will it work? Well, what we've done is we've developed clear learning outcomes for each of the levels and along all of the strategic priorities for our learners. So for instance, in the outcome, one set of outcomes you probably can't read. For instance, so this is the research capacity, at the connect level, ask in-depth and increasingly discipline-specific questions about a topic of interest, compare and contrast samples of existing knowledge, research, and/or views, identify problem-solving strategies and methods appropriate to a research project, etc. We've worked collaboratively with folks who are in those areas. So for instance, our Vice President Research and Grad Studies has worked closely with us on developing those outcomes. We're also working with faculty members in different schools and divisions so that we ensure that what we're sort of putting in there makes sense to them. So the idea is that a student can come in at any point in the pathway and basically provide evidence in their portfolio that they have met the outcome. We'll assess it in an interdisciplinary way and then decide whether a student will receive that credential. And so we're envisioning that students will be able to get badges. We don't want students to fill up the matrix. So we're not expecting students to hit every level of every priority, but rather we want to open up space for them to sort of decide where are the areas that I really want to work on and how do I want to get some credit for that learning that happens. I'm envisioning that we may have high school students, traditional age students coming in who've had the opportunity to do a community service learning abroad. They're probably not going to be at Discover Intercultural Understanding because they've had some experience with that already. They may come in at Connect or Experience with the evidence that they have to meet that particular set of outcomes. We have a really rigorous undergraduate research program on our campus, and so we want to provide opportunities for students to develop those skills and abilities as they come in. Similarly, if I have a mature student who's coming back to finish their degree who's been a professional, they're probably not going to be at the bottom of entrepreneurial capacity. We want to open up space for them to get recognized for the skills and knowledge that they're bringing into the university, but they may need to start more at the beginning for student success because maybe they haven't been in a classroom for a long time. And how can we document that and open up space for them to develop those skills and abilities really effectively? So for example, we might have an ePortfolio that looks a little like this. This is a fourth year geography student in a Bachelor of Arts program. Her mission is work in an NGO abroad, so we're opening up space for them to think about that. They're a transfer student from another university, and they're involved in diverse learning opportunities. So the evidence might include a reflection on our learning styles inventory and what that meant for her. So that's more the Discover student success. She might have evidence of a high school community service learning, so she might have photos and a reflection, which was evidence of Connect, intercultural capacity. Maybe her undergraduate research poster, which is more Discover undergraduate research or experience. Co-op work experience, which again might be at the experience level, and then a geography field trip where she's really becoming the person that she wants to be as she works toward that working in an NGO abroad. So you can kind of see how these portfolios will look very different depending on how a student wants to develop their pathway. So what are some of the implications for bridging? And I get asked these questions all the time. How are you going to do this? I think we need to engage all members of our communities to support these learning pathways. We're working really diligently to connect with faculty across the schools and divisions, to work with staff in our student affairs units to make sure that we're able to articulate and work with them and understand what evidence might look like, and to also set experiences up for students whereby they're actually creating evidence that will help them document. We need obviously pedagogical support for faculty and instructors around notions of adaptive learning, experiential learning, to make sure that we really set people up for success in doing this kind of work. Assessment strategies obviously need to be developed. So what we're envisioning at this point, I mentioned that we have developed rubrics, although my team is very stressed about the rubrics and want to make sure that they're really going to work. And I've sort of said, well, you know what? Let's get a sense of what we want them to look like, but at the end of the day, until we start seeing evidence, we really won't know whether or not the rubric's appropriate. So we really want to work with the students themselves to make sure that we're communicating that effectively. And similarly, we'll want to train our staff and faculty to work on teams to do that kind of assessment so that we can sort of award those credentials where necessary. And we need to think about scalability. We have about 12,000 students on campus and about the same number of students who are fully online. So what will this look like as we're moving forward? And so we're thinking through some of those strategies to try and to make sure that we address all of the interesting opportunities that will arise as a result of doing this work. So we're quite excited about it. I think it does really give us an opportunity to sort of weigh into that conversation that's happening in higher education today about the various types of learning that happens in MOOCs, with credentials and badges, you know, how we will think about education moving forward. And I think the other opportunity here is really to work with faculty and staff across the campus to design some neat programs that might address pathways in unique ways. So I'm envisioning that we may package together, for instance, our first year co-op career course, which is actually a 1-credit course with perhaps 3 to 6 credits in different academic disciplines. We have a credential in global competency. So how might we package some of those things up to give students added value and allow them to sort of identify where they want to be on that pathway? I think there's some really neat opportunities for future work that goes beyond, you know, just sort of redesigning curriculum in a kind of a traditional way. So I think when we do that, we might get to experience the joy of learning together, and I think that's really what we should all be about at universities. So I hope that's piqued your interest, given you some ideas, and look forward to the conversation with you. Thank you.
So again, just a reminder, we do have some folks online, and if any questions come in from there, we will kind of go that route. But in the meantime, when questions come up, if you want to raise your hand, and I'll pass the mic to you, and this will get...
Yeah, I usually have something to say about everything, but
I love it, Bruno.
I'm very happy that you stress the importance of learning as a process, because you know, I think that that's what it is, and for the longest time we kept thinking of it as a product in some respect. But also, the very important point that you bring about connection in the example that you gave is such an important one, because we have spent so much time teaching courses in ways that often don't relate. We tried with a capstone, for example, to integrate this, but that's been very ineffective. For example, I'll have a student come in and I'll say, "Didn't you take that course?" And they said, "Yeah, I received an A in it." And I'll say, "Well, why can't you apply what you learned here over here?" Because no one ever asked them to. Nobody asked, what is the connection? Because they take courses as individual things without ever seeing what it is. And I think that's what the ePortfolio, if you call it, for me, a revolution or a movement, a change in the way pedagogy is thought about these days, both as lifelong learners and so forth, is in this issue of being able to articulate what it is that you're doing. How could you go anywhere without a map, for example, that you're wandering blindly, aimlessly, without ever having reflected on even why you're here and what you do? I think we should have been doing that from day one. But it's a wonder how people haven't been damaged by our educational system in a way that has taught them these very discrete experiences and have not looked at the bigger picture or talked about learning. So, I mean, you're talking to the choir here, or singing to the choir. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I know that you do a really great job of this in your own classes. And I think when we went to university, it was a different world, right? We didn't have access to the internet. We didn't have access to information all day, every day. You know, and we weren't working. I mean, I did have a part-time job, but there wasn't the same pressure, I think, on us. I remember going to university because I thought, what a cool opportunity, and I hate summer because I'm not in school, so I want to go to school. Well, you know, now there's a lot of pressure for students to come to get a job, but again, what is that job going to look like? We probably can't predict. However, we can make sure that they're learning those skills and transferring knowledge between contexts. It shouldn't be what happens in a classroom stays in a classroom. And we really don't want our students practicing intellectual bulimia. Take it all in, purge it on the final exam, and then move on, right? So how can we give them opportunities to make those connections? And I think what you're speaking about is one of the first projects we worked on when I used to be at the University of Waterloo around ePortfolios, where similar kind of case professors were saying, well, the students were supposed to take that prereq course. Why? And you know, do you know how to do? No, we've never heard of that before. And the professor would say to the first professor, what's going on with you? Why didn't you teach students that stuff? Well, I did, right? And so using the portfolios to capture some of that knowledge, so then the second professor could say, now go back to your portfolio where you've thought this through, and let's extend it, right? So there are so many interesting uses for portfolios.
Yeah. One quick thing too that I wanted to mention is that we spent the last 4 or 5 years trying to get ePortfolio on this campus. It finally came to be. But one of the aspects that was difficult is the resistance from other faculty who haven't seen the light yet, who are still doing away on their old coffee stain papers that they've had for years or whatever. Maybe they've adapted PowerPoint, let's not play that. But the thing that frustrates me is that faculty need to have these conversations, and they're very hard to have.
Yep.
It's not just about letting go of old ways. It's about reevaluating what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how would you know you've done it if you saw it. And that's what we should be doing all the time. But you know, I'm getting ready to retire, and I'm getting at the end of my academic career, and I'm thinking, what has all this been about? Why haven't we been doing this for so long? Did it take technology to allow us to do this? Did it take the technology to permit us to start thinking in different ways, perhaps? Whereas before we felt we were the knowledge givers and they were the receivers. But as we mentioned, and I'll stop talking, is the issue of it was always top down. And it's with the advent of online teaching that I saw bottom up.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. It's the authenticity of the learner. It's about the learner. It's not about the teacher.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think we have a really important role to play as experts in our disciplines in terms of helping the learner understand how and why they'd want to study in our discipline and what they can do with that knowledge or those skills and abilities. But I think you're right. I mean, I think we're in a climate now where we really are focused more on the learner. And what I like about this approach is that it really is situated in the learner and celebrating the fact that the learner can take some control and responsibility over their learning. Now, let's be honest, traditional students anyway haven't been taught to do this, right? So there are some challenges ahead. We're going to need to help them develop those skills and abilities over time. We know from research that we've done that reflection is a developmental ability. Students need practice. They need feedback on that work. So that all has to be built into the system. But I really believe that if we have faculty members across the campus asking students the question, how does this connect? We provide spaces for them to do that, then I think we really will see a difference in the graduates that we're turning out. Not that our graduates are bad, it's just can we be even more intentional with them? Yeah. Hi.
I thought colored acetates were the golden bullet for education. So I'll go back a little further. And Bruno is absolutely right about, he and I agree with about everything. And he's my mentor for that. But he has graduate students who help him with his ePortfolios. I don't.
Right.
And so I always like to ask this question of our experts who come in. If you have a class of 10 or 12, you can reflect with those people, sit down and do a group hug about these reflections and all this kind of stuff, and really get them and motivate them and on and on.
Sure.
But you have an intro class of 65 or 70, or even an upper division class, say, of 40. You know, I think we need some practical advice here on, if this is going to work, you're going to have to institutionalize this in the sense of class size or something, graduate students or whatever. Yeah. So I'd like to hear your comments here on the practical nature of using this. And I assume that some of these people were doing this volunteer-wise, and that I'd like to hear that. But if we're going to use it in a class, it's a purpose, it's a grade, you how to do it, I've got to grade it, and that's all there is to it.
Yep. Points well taken. And I would say it's all about the design. So the class that I referred to, the history and film class, 250 students. And we were doing this work really actively. But it took some time for me to think through, and I had help with this, I didn't do it on my own, to think through how could I align my outcomes so that key outcome of I want students to learn to think historically with the learning activities that I was engaging them in, and then the assessment strategies that I was using. And what I realized with some feedback from others is that I really needed to model that practice because they weren't coming in knowing how to do that. And so I designed the lectures such that I modeled for them the kind of thinking I wanted them to engage in. I gave them time in class to reflect on, and I provided feedback in a way that made sense. So I will admit, the first time I taught it, I had them reflecting every class. Well, 200 students, times 12 weeks of classes. I nearly died. I got through it, but I thought, that was not the best approach. So I went to beginning, middle, and end reflections with some other kinds of activities built in there. So it's really about thinking through how much time do you have, how much support do you have, what kinds of activities you need to engage them in so that you actually will know that they're building the skills to meet the outcomes, and what kind of assessments will you use to gauge did they get there. In my world, when I teach using portfolios in courses, the portfolio assignment altogether, so I have assignments that go into the portfolio along the way as they're developing those abilities and documenting their learning that results in a culminating activity. All that stuff together is usually worth about 60% of their grade. So they know this is really important and this is a central part of what they're doing in my class, so that it's all kind of measured out. So happy to share some of those designs with you. I would say the folks in Academic Innovations are certainly happy to help. Heather is an instructional designer and others. So I would say work with others, get feedback on that design, and start small. I mean, you don't have to change your whole class all at once. Maybe it's just integrating a reflective assignment that meets an outcome that you already have to get them to sort of start that thinking. So there are lots of different ways you can do it.
Are you still using midterms and finals?
Early on I was still using a midterm and final. I got rid of the final pretty quickly because the portfolio became the culminating activity. I have continued to use midterms in some contexts where I have large classes as a way to check in with them. But I have really changed altogether the kinds of assessments that I use. And I know for sure they're still developing the abilities that they need to have at the right moment in time in their, whether it's a history degree or another degree, because I've built that in. For instance, I don't necessarily have students write the full research paper. I might have them come up with a really good thesis argument, because maybe at that stage of learning, that's all they need to develop. Some of my colleagues think that's abhorrent behavior, though, on my part, right? Because, for them, that paper is really essential. And it really has to fit with your own philosophy and what you value as a teacher and what you value in your discipline. Yeah.
The way that we've handled hundreds of students is through the eFolio thinking paper. Mm-hmm. And they use the eFolio thinking strategy, the select, collect, reflect, connect, respect,
through their references, for example. And they all do that. First they were doing it weekly, then they do it for the whole year. And what does that mean now? And you get a really good sense of, did they get the bigger meaning rather than the simple key concept meaning? So we use the structured eFolio structure as a form of pedagogy in the classroom. So it's not just
I understand that part.
Yeah.
It's the practical time, life is short and you don't have the time to reflect on 28 pages of ePortfolio.
Not
Great.
28 pages.
Well,
No.
okay.
No.
Digestible pieces.
It's 2 pages. It's more condensed.
The whole
about
class,
what it is,
they condensed to 2 pages?
They condense it down, yeah. I don't want to read that 28 pages. They already have a term paper. I don't need to read. I'm looking, did they get it? You can look, in 2 pages, you can.
Why couldn't you do that in a final exam and have them write a 2-page essay to question 3?
Because there's specific things that I'm looking for.
And do you grade those specific things?
It's called critical thinking.
Do you have a rubric for that?
Yes, I have a rubric.
Oh, very good. I spend too much time in your office.
Well, and in light of the time that we have, here's another question in the back.
I just had one question. This is a great shift of moving towards individual learners. But when we start to think about evaluating the program or the course, could maybe you or Helen speak to ways in which we synthesize these individual ePortfolios into is our program working? Is the course effective? Those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are lots of universities that are doing really good work on that front. So they're really sampling evidence from across the program to sort of say, are we seeing evidence that students are meeting the outcomes? And again, I like the portfolios for that, and using really clear rubrics too, so that everyone's assessing the same thing. And I like that approach because it gives you some reliability and validity of, are we actually doing the right thing? And it also shows you, and we've done it in a program that I taught in where we had introductory ePortfolio work, a milestone in a 3rd-year course, and then in the capstone, we could pull evidence of portfolios from the capstone students and say, are we hitting the mark? And we can see pretty quickly whether there are gaps, and then go back to those individual courses and instructors to make sure that we're really addressing. And I think that the infusion of a portfolio through a whole program allows you to sort of track formatively how are we doing in the whole program, so that you can kind of catch things along the way. And actually we got to the portfolio in a curriculum redesign because we realized we didn't really know whether students were meeting the desired outcomes at the end of our program. We wanted to be really sure that we were turning out students who had developed those abilities. Helen, do you want to add in from other universities?
Yeah, I think the example I would point you to is Portland State University.
Yeah.
They have a really fantastic general education program that is really part of their university studies program that really is looking at more of an outcomes-based rather than a traditional, take 2 classes in science, 2 classes in humanities, and that kind of thing. Our colleague Kevin Kelly, who used to be at San Francisco State University, really talks about, as Tracy alluded to, this alignment among, let's say, the institutional learning outcomes to the school, to the department, to the program, to the course, and then down to the actual assignment that you're going to give to a student that's going to produce this evidence that you're then going to hold up and evaluate using a rubric around, quantitative literacy or something like that. So I think that alignment is really critical if you're going to say, how does this portfolio represent where we think students are in this program or along these various competencies?
Any other questions? And we're right about at 12:30, so if anyone has to leave, we understand, thank you. But if you can stay in there a few minutes, that would be wonderful.
This will be just very quick. I've really enjoyed both of the talks. The focus has been on students. We're students too, and we're learners.
Yes.
And one of the things that I'm interested in as a faculty member, in addition to my classes and my students, is how we can apply ePortfolios to faculty for our files for retention, promotion, and tenure, and other areas of our lives as well, because primarily we're learners as well. It's a journey, just like ePortfolios are. It's a journey, not a destination.
That's such a great point, and I think we really, if we're going to do this work, ought to be modeling the kind of thinking we want to see in our students. So I think you're absolutely right. Building it into all of those other processes that we engage in as faculty members is really important, and I think Heather can probably speak to the work that's happening here in terms of P&T portfolios and things.
Well, and I'll say there's a couple things that have been going on. One of the big things is I just started kind of an initiative for faculty about building your online presence as a faculty member using the ePortfolio system. One, because we often work, in our little silos. Our own colleagues don't know what we're doing often, let alone administrators and things along those lines. So in order to promote ourselves, our work, our department, and the work that comes out of our department, I'm encouraging faculty to meet with me. I've already had a few workshops, a few more will be coming up about that, because I think that's really important to start kind of setting the bar. Plus, one of the big things that has come out of ePortfolios is they've looked at students who have bought into portfolios and used them and succeeded with them, and one of the big things that the research has come out when they surveyed those students and said why, they said faculty buy-in. The faculty saw value in it. And the faculty transmitted that value back to the students, and they saw that. And so how do you do that? Well, part of it is by crafting your own. The other is, as some of you have probably heard, and there's a few people who are part of the pilot program in the room already, but we do have a promotion and tenure electronic portfolio that we've been working on as a pilot program. We've also set up, and I'm finalizing the flow tomorrow for the electronic review itself, actually. So it won't just be even an electronic portfolio, but the review process will go through electronically. And so those are just a few things already. I've also been meeting with different faculty members and or departments. I'm taking some of my courses and putting them into a portfolio and things along those lines to see how that could work in those kinds of ways. So starting to really weave that personal and that academic side kind of all together in order to put it back out there, which is exactly what we're asking our students to do if we're doing this. So trying to tie all those pieces and parts together. So yeah, it's happening.
It's going to become more and more relevant because as a peer review member of many committees where I review these files, those files that are better organized are much easier with regard to promotion and tenure and so forth, compared to a file that shows no reflection, and in fact, it was over the years we didn't have reflection before. We started having self-reviews, and that was a step in the right direction. But I've seen the difference, how easy it is to promote someone who has done the kind of, so it is an exercise you need to learn to do, and you get better and better at doing it as you do it regularly. If you don't do it regularly, you wait for your 6-year or 3-year review process, it's a mess and you don't know what to do. So you've got to do this on a regular basis, almost monthly.
Yeah.
And I would say it's also important too, I mean, we ask our students, when I say vulnerable, I don't mean like let's get together and hug kind of thing in a portfolio, but we are asking them to pull these different identities, these different selves together. And for students, that it might be uncomfortable because, this is my student identity, this is my home identity, this is my cultural identity, right? We have all these different identities. And so if we're asking our students to do that, I know a lot of times as, a faculty member, I don't want my students to know all these things about me. And I'm still not revealing, my deepest, darkest secrets, right? But I might start to weave in the personal in some of that, maybe my extracurriculars where I do volunteer work, my research interests. And so we become more human as well. And so we want our students, understanding their process through review, and reflection. It's nice to go through that process too, so then we can relate that, okay, this might be different. Right, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope it's been useful. Certainly happy to have further conversations online or Skype or whatever would be helpful, and wish you all the best in your ePortfolio pathway that you undertake. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.